when you want some salt, you probably don't even think about where you're going to get it. Your dad or your mom just go to the cabinet and they pull out some salt, pound and a half of salt from the store. They never think about how they're going to get the salt. Today, most salt is mined in vast underground mines. This one is under Lake Erie near Cleveland, Ohio. And these are where great inland seas evaporated, leaving salt behind. The same thing still happening today in places like the Great Salt Lake in Utah. But for our ancestors, Wikapakani salt came from a place that in some ways was very different and in some ways was the same. This is the Great Salt Spring in what is today southern Illinois, one of the most important places for salt making for Myaamia people. This contains about 1 weight% salt dissolved in this water. Now, where that water got that salt is from the same ancient oceans, but not laying down vast layers of salt, but tiny bits of salt in the rocks that the water flowing through those rocks today dissolves and brings to the surface. And so salt came not as a solid, not from mining, but from getting the salt out of these salt springs, the water of this salt spring. And we're going to learn a little bit more about how that was done. So how exactly do we get the water, the salt, out of the water? Here we have some salt water. It's about as salty as from the Great Salt Springs, and you can taste it, and yeah, it's salty, all right. Kind of makes you make a funny face. It's about half as salty as seawater if you've ever been to the ocean and gotten some water in your mouth. But how exactly do we do this? Well, we're going to take our salt water and we're going to dump it in a pan. Here we're using a dark bottom pan because we want you to be able to see what happens with the salt when it actually starts to come out. So we're just going to take our salt water here and we're going to dump it in our pan. And it's okay if we spill a little bit. That's no big deal. Put it all in the pan. Now we're going to take and we're going to turn our stove on. We're going to turn it all the way up here. We're just going to let it go all the way to high. What? Yeah, our ancestors many generations ago didn't have stoves, did they? And if they had a stove, they couldn't have taken it out to the Great Salt Spring to make the salt. So how did they get the salt out of the salt water? Well, let's take a look at that. No. Our ancestors didn't have stoves, so they used what they had, fire, fueled by wood. And they would create these fires in order to boil the water to evaporate. Mostly they used clay pots, made like this one, but probably much, much bigger. How much water did they have to evaporate? Well, we hear that Myaamia people would often trade blocks of salt that weighed about 50 pounds. In order to make 50 pounds of salt, you had to evaporate about 500 gallons of water. So imagine something like this, but much, much bigger. Filled with water, sitting over a fire, evaporating that water to make the salt. Later, steel pots were used. Maybe closest I have is something like this. This is a Dutch oven. You can see it's flat bottom. That gives you the advantage if you get more heat on the bottom surface. And many of the clay pots that our ancestors used were made with flat bottoms, very large. You hear that buzz? What is that? Oh, nalaki. Every 17 years, the cicadas come out here in Virginia. They make a horrible ruckus. I found one here. This poor little guy didn't quite make it. He lived his life, probably only about a week. But if you hear that buzz, that's nalaki. Every 17 years we get that here. Now, how much wood would it take? Well, if I could get all of the heat out of the wood that's on this fire and put it into, say, 2 gallons of water, I could evaporate all of that water. But unfortunately, that's hard to do because you lose heat to the surrounding environment. You can feel that heat coming off the fire. And you can put stones around it. You can use flat bottom pans, and that helps. But it takes a lot more wood than this to evaporate the amounts of water that our people would use to make with Kapakani to make salt. So how much wood did they need? So how much wood did you need in order to boil, say, 500 gallons of water to make 50 pounds of salt? Well, it might have been this much. Now, this is a lot of wood. And at some point, and we're not exactly sure when, it wasn't the amount of water that limited how much salt could be made, but the amount of wood. The wood that provided the heat for the fires. And archaeologists, people who study things from the past, have found logs that have been hollowed out and covered in salt, salt encrusted in the middle. And we know that water was being run downhill through these logs, not to where there was more water, but to where there was wood. And so the water was piped further and further away from the spring as the woods were cleared further and further back. And so wood is what really fueled the salt making with Kapakani for our people. Okay, so we're back in the house and our water's starting to boil. And so we're going to turn the stove down just a little bit. And we have to boil off about 90% of the water in order to get the salt to come out of the water, to precipitate from that water. And so now we just wait. So after about 40 minutes of boiling, you can see we have a lot less water in the pan, but you can start to see along the edges here, we have salt building up on the edges of the pan. So not all of the salt is going to be down in the bottom at the end. We're going to have to scrape the salt off the entire sides of the pan if we want to get as much salt as we can. After another 10 minutes or so, we can see that salt is really starting to come out around the edges here. You can flake the salt off the edges, and that's where the water is becoming saturated. That's a fancy word for saying there's more salt in the water than the water can hold, and so it becomes a solid. It precipitates out of the water. And so we have this solid salt along the edge that you can scrape off with a spoon. So after a little more than an hour, we've boiled down the water to the point where the salt has completely precipitated out. You can see it's just wet salt. If we keep boiling it at this point, we run the risk of burning the salt. And so we're going to take this slightly wet salt and we're going to strain it out. And this is something our ancestors did using reed mats that they found imprints of on the clay pots. And so you just take this. We're going to take this this little strainer here with a green cloth, and the green is just so you can see it. And I'm going to just dump this all in here, and we'll let the water run out, and we'll just capture the salt in here. So I'm going to try to get it all in one place, okay? So we're just going to take this, and we'll just scrape most of this out of here into this one little place, okay? Now it's still a little bit wet, and so now that we have the salt out of the pan, we can pick this up and we can just squeeze it. We're just going to squeeze the water out of that salt. And you can see the water that's still coming out of that salt, right? So after all that work, this is still a little wet, but after all that work, what we end up with is this little pile of salt. And so from all of our work of a half a gallon of water from something like the Great Salt Spring, we end up with a little ball of salt about that big. So the next time you go and you grab the big salt container from the store and you think, oh, well, you know, it's easy to get salt. I want you to just think about how much work our ancestors had to put in to making salt with kapakani, and how important it was to our culture. And so next time you just grab a little bit and eat it, I just want you to think about this. Nelanakate.